I'm really pleased to follow Bernard Cooperman, Ben Ravid, and Ken Stowe, who are all sort of scholarly idols of mine. I mean, I've read their work, I've used their work, I've plagiarized. No, I haven't plagiarized their work. I have been inspired by their work. And in fact, it was Ravid's question put to me in some emails a number of years ago when I was looking for a topic to look at in Venice when I went over there for an NEH seminar about Renaissance civic space, that got me to thinking about reading the ghetto in contemporary terms rather than, that is, contemporary 16th century terms rather than 20th century terms. So I believe very much in looking at history horizontally, not vertically. If you're myopic and looking at a particular topic through history, drilling a core sample through the centuries, if you will, and only extracting those particular incidents on your timeline that fit your post facto interpretation, you're going to be losing an awful lot. You also may be giving extra weight to obviously what you're studying. And all scholars are guilty of this because we all think that what we're studying at the moment is the most important thing in the world. Graduate students, I'm sure your dissertations are the most important thing in the world. What I want to do today, and what I tried to do in my paper, is to contextualize the ghetto in Venice. And I'm really not looking at the Italian ghetto per se, although I have looked at some of the other ghettos in other contexts, but the Venetian ghetto especially, looking at it in the context of late 15th and early 16th century Venice, the social, the cultural, the economic, and the legal structures, to understand how exceptional the ghetto was, and how, if not ordinary, at least how understandable, how expected it would have been both to Jews and non-Jews in 1516 when the ghetto was first established. I think one can do this even more broadly than I've attempted to do in the paper. So I've looked at the way the state had treated different groups, and my particular entree into this was actually looking at the physical city as an architectural historian and noticing that the ghetto wasn't the only enclosed space in Venice at the time. The city was a collection of enclosed spaces, and hence the subtitle, the culture of inclusion. Sorry, the culture of enclosure. None of the previous speakers showed you images, so we're talking about the ghetto somewhat in the abstract. So I have a lot of pictures, and I'll run through a lot of them quickly, and I'll use them to illustrate certain points, and then we can elaborate them in the discussion. And so some of them I may whiz by very quickly, but we can come back to later, or look at some other context. So Venice, as you see as a whole, behind us, is a unique environment. So already it's going to be separate from so many different other Italian cities, in the same way that Italian cities are very different from a place like Krakow that Cooperman talked about. Italian cities are very old. They have older traditions. They have older neighborhoods, and it's a different topic, but it's important to remember. Many contemporary authors remarked that Venice was a city of islands. It was really many cities in one. And you can see this in some of the illustrations. This is the frontispiece to Sansovino's book in 1570, in which he actually uses that line. And Sansovino was a great architect. This was published posthumously, but it is, you can see the divisions, and that's the way the city was built. Basically putting down piles, landfill, and creating these little islands in the Venetian lagoon. The city was developed into 6 main regions, which are in color here. This is not my map, and I apologize. I can't remember whose map it is, and unfortunately the title is obscured there. So my apologies to the author, but it's a wonderful depiction. And it was an effort to locate the various parishes in the city. This is the area of where San Marco is, and that's where the government was located, and that's where all the ceremonies took place. This is the Rialto up here, where a lot of the commerce took place. This is the arsenal area down here, where a lot of the manufacturing took place. And where the Jews were sent up here was kind of a no man's land. Around 1500, it was the newest part of the city that was just being developed at that time. And there was a lot of open land. And in the 1400s, a lot of religious institutions were established there on large plots. The ghetto, which you see here in a view from the Barbary map of 1500, I'll show you a clear one in a minute, was surrounded by a number of these, there's one over here, institutions. There's sort of a constellation of these walled little cities. The difference is that the others were mostly monasteries or places like the Ospedale de Misericordia. The Jewish ghetto was a place of residence for citizens otherwise active in the city and in the world. So their residential space was enclosed, but the rest of their lives was not. And in this I agree. During the daytime there was perfect fluidity in the ghetto in Venice, though it was closed up at night. It was described as like a castle, and in a sense it is, though we're not sure these two buildings were actually built until later. But this is the way it looked in the 1500 view before the Jews moved there. It was actually built probably as a housing development. And I'll show you there are many of that type that were being built in the 1400s and early 1500s. Here's the monastery of San Girolamo. And you can see you can almost jump from one to another, except they're both walled. And so the physical qualities of the place were not terribly out of context. This is what it looks like today, and it's most noted for its impressive campo, which is like its living room. It's a city there, and the tall buildings that ring it. One of the myths about the ghetto is that it has the tallest buildings in Venice. It is the most isolated place in Venice. It is the most enclosed space in Venice. And in fact, in all those regards, it is not. It is among those that are most enclosed and the places that have the tallest buildings. But you can find examples of almost every individual physical aspect that exists in the ghetto in other places in Venice. In the same way, if you look at the policies that established the ghetto in 1516, you can find an example of almost every other restrictive provision on the ghetto somewhere else, in some other context, in Venetian life and society. However, never do you find all of these things in one place, and that's what makes the ghetto unique. The ghetto was the most restrictive environment for non-clerics, and it did have an unusual assortment of architectural features brought together in that one area. But if you look at the kind of place it was, this is the ghetto, and you can see it's only accessed originally from here. This is the Ghetto Nuovo, which is actually the oldest ghetto. This is the part that was the foundry. The Ghetto Vecchio, which is where the Levantine traders settled here, and then the Ghetto Nuovissimo over here. This is the Campo San Polo, one of the most important and biggest campos in Venice. And you can see spatially it's very much the same. And actually, if you trace the canals going around it, you'll see that there are very few actual points of access to this particular island with this campo. And if you go back to 1500, you'll find there were even fewer, maybe only 2, just like the ghetto. So again, I want to emphasize that in many ways the ghetto was not so unusual. You know from the previous papers something of the history of the site. The tall buildings are something that developed over time. This is one of the problems that a lot of people who write about the ghetto, not our previous speakers, but the myths of the ghetto that have been promulgated, is they're looking at the original ghetto through all of the accretions of later centuries. But the ghetto developed over time and became increasingly more restricted and more overcrowded. But at the same time, it became more and more popular for Jews from other places to move to, which is one of the reasons it became overcrowded. In the same way, in Rome, most of our ideas of the Roman ghetto are those put forward by the great historian Ferdinand Gregorovius in the 19th century. When he visited the ghetto, and he wrote a whole book about it, it was a slum. It was as bad or worse than anything in the Lower East Side when the Lower East Side was a modern ghetto/slum. But that was 300 years of development, of neglect, of overcrowding, of gradual suppression. But when the ghetto was founded in 1555, essentially it was an enclosure of streets where Jews had already lived, and was not as much as an imposition as it would later become. The tall buildings grew over time, and curiously, one of the reasons the buildings grew so tall was this curious conflation where the Jews were not allowed to live anywhere else, so they needed more space. So that was repressive. On the other hand, the Jews, even though the properties had to be owned by Christians, were given in the courts permission. Basically, they were given control over the properties that they didn't own, so they could continue to develop them personally, subdivide them, add floors, expand them. So they had actually more liberty in developing the properties and actually making money as sub-renters, subtenants in the ghetto than they would have had if they were in other parts of Venice. So it's a curious situation, but that's why they're so tall. Okay. Now, there are tall buildings other places in Venice too. We have them. You can't see these too well, but I'm going to mention some of these places later because the Borgo Loco San Lorenzo is actually a planned development, more or less contemporary with the ghetto, of an enclosed space. It's for housing. It's for working class and for indigent people to live in. The Sottoporteghi dei Armeni, it's hard to see. This is a very narrow street, about half the width, maybe it's only from the table to this wall, but the buildings are 7 stories, 6, 7 stories high. This was the Armenian quarter in Venice, so go figure. However, the Armenians were not required to live there, but they did live there anyway. And it was actually, as we'll see later, had a gate. There was water around the ghetto. It was enclosed, but there were windows, but the windows on the ground floor were closed up by order. We don't know actually how much this was actually enforced. I suspect that there was a lot of in and out and smuggling and sort of shenanigans going on at night. And this is a picture when I was there a few years ago. This man actually was climbing out of one of the windows to get into a boat, so it still goes on. The Campo I mentioned, it actually has 3 wells, which is more water supply than many campi have in Venice, and so on. I don't want to take too much more time. So the area, this is Cannaregio. This is the Barbary plan. Many of these enclosures, you have to look in detail. There's some up here. And the Servite monastery, you can't see very well, it's over here. These are other details from the map. If you take a magnifying glass, although since I put this together, there's a great digital image now of the Barbary plan. Unfortunately, you can't download it, but you can use it online and zoom in. You can go over the whole map and count scores of these walled spaces, more than exists today. This is the Servite convent, which is no longer there. It was closed a long time ago, but the walls are still there. And these are the walls. Whoops. Wrong. These are the walls that you can still see. And this is only about 2 canals down from the ghetto. Okay. Now, there were a lot of foreign quarters in the ghetto. And I mentioned some of these: Greeks, Germans, Albanians, Armenians, and others. They've been studied significantly by Donatella Calabi. This is her map putting some of those neighborhoods. The ghetto is way up here. Oops. The ghetto is here. And I'll just show you a few of these places. This is the Fondaco dei Tedeschi that I mentioned in the paper, which is the most impressive enclosure. It's architecturally significant. It is prominently located, but it still is an enclosure. And Germans still had to reside there if they came to the city. They still had to keep their goods there, and the place was locked up. There was a curfew as well. This is the Greek quarter, and it's around this church here. I described something of its history, and I'll just show you. These are some of the little streets, and they're gated. And if I've walked these streets, and I looked very carefully at the door jambs of the gates, and there were gates on these doors. The question is, were they locked from within or without? And my guess is they were locked from within. So the Greeks had control of their own district in a way that the Jews did not. So there are a lot of these streets. And this is the Armenian street, which I've already mentioned. Another area that there were enclosures, and they has something to consider in conjunction with the ghetto, were the scuole. These are the confraternities and the other organizations that existed. They were put together by the arti, the guilds, and they really organized the entire working class in Venice. There were over 100 arti. There were 6 major ones, but there were all these other ones. And the small ones, like this one of the shoemakers, had these buildings on little campi, little piazzas, and there would be meeting rooms upstairs, very similar to the synagogues, which are on the upper floors of some of the buildings at the ghetto. But the big, the ghetto gates, which you see here, are very similar to, there's the consulae. But also the big scuole had enclosures as well. This is the scuola of San Giovanni Evangelisti, and this was a gateway done by the great architect Cadusi. But it's very grand. But as you go into it, there's a square enclosure, and there are buildings controlled by the scuola, including a hospital. There's only this one main entrance, and then in the back, there's a little gate with very controlled access, and there's a long street that goes through it, and there's a series of gates that one has to go through. So we get that as well. All right. Let me just do one other aspect of enclosure, and then we can open things up for discussion. These housing developments. From the mid-1400s through the mid-1500s, there was a housing crisis in Venice. And the state tried to do this, deal with this in different ways. It encouraged private development. There were also charitable organizations that took the initiative, sounds very familiar, just like today, in setting up hospices, setting up housing for the indigent. And then occasionally there was state-sponsored project as well. We have a number of these on the 1500 plan by Barbary, and this is the, oops, something just, yeah. Right. You know, maybe that's a good time to just decided to stop. We have a number of these in Barbary, and you can still visit about at least a half a dozen of them. Many more have been redeveloped in subsequent periods. Some of them, like the Corte San Marco, are remarkably like going into the ghetto. There's a very modest gate that you can hardly see as you walk by the street. You go in, you can see where it used to lock, and then suddenly you're in a big courtyard with houses around. These houses are all identical, and the doorways are actually numbered because they were rented by the developer. But this was an enclosed community, and it's out in that same peripheral area that I mentioned, the ghetto, where, shall we say, a particular class of people were encouraged to reside. It doesn't have any of the strictures. The amount of force and legal requirements is never quite the same as the ghetto, but the motivation of separation and enclosure, and that means the motivation of some kind of control over people's residence and their lives was very similar. In many ways, Jews had more freedoms because they had certain economic possibilities that a lot of these other people didn't have. That's something more for other historians to explore. But from a totally spatial point of view, you see that the ghetto is part of a constellation of enclosures, which makes me think that in the time, and for other reasons too that are explained in the paper, the Jews would not have been so, well, they weren't so upset about the requirement, or one might say the opportunity, to move to the ghetto in 1516. Okay, let's leave it at that, and we can open things up because there are a lot of ideas, and maybe I can pull up some images if any people have questions as we go forward.